Back when I was in the 6th grade, I had a close-knit group of friends. There were four of us, and we were all girls, and we hung out all the time. Sleepovers were a norm for us, and we would usually rotate houses, seeing as all of our parents knew each other, and we all lived relatively close to each other, with the furthest only being about 10 minutes away. One particular sleepover, we were at my friend Caitlin's house, and two of her cousins just happened to also be sleeping over. Caitlin had two older sisters and an older brother, and they were all really nice and friendly. During our sleepovers, they usually just stayed in their rooms and only came out for food, so we never really felt like we were imposing on them. Her brother would let us play with his PlayStation 2 sometimes, and his sisters would talk to us about boys and high school gossip, which at the time we thought was really cool. Overall, Caitlin had a great relationship with her siblings. I couldn't say the same for her cousins, though. One of her cousins was in the 8th grade, and she was closer in age to one of Caitlin's older sisters, who was a freshman in high school, so she was staying in her room. The other one was a boy who was a junior in high school and naturally stayed in Caitlin's brother's room. The girl was nice, even if she seemed a bit shy. The guy, however, just gave me the creeps. He was definitely more outgoing, but something about his mannerisms were strange. And when he smiled, it looked like he was smiling at something he thought of in his head, and not necessarily at you. He had shoulder-length, stringy, and greasy, dirty blonde hair, and he was pretty scrawny for a guy his age. He looked like he could be a freshman in high school. Caitlin really seemed uncomfortable around him. Later on, when we were in Caitlin's room, she told us that she recently met her cousins because their mom and their mom had a falling out over the few years and weren't talking to each other. They recently reconnected, and so they thought it would be a good idea if Caitlin's aunt and her children came to visit for a weekend. Caitlin said that her female cousin was nice, but she thought that the guy was really weird. Ever since he got to their house, he's been trying to hang out with her instead of her brother. He would go into her room and go through her toys and books and try to make conversation with her. He was also kind of touchy. He would pet her cheeks and her hair. When she would flinch or move away from him, he would get this really cold look in his eyes and would stare at her for a few seconds before smiling that creepy smile he does. We all agreed that it was really weird, but eventually moved on to other things and talked about the usual stuff 6th graders talk about. We ended up watching a movie before bed and took our turns to go to the bathroom in the hallway that Caitlin shared with one of her sisters. Everyone called dibs on their own turn, and since I didn't really care, I was the last to go there. When my friend Lucy came back and told me she was done, I was relieved because I was getting antsy and tired and just wanted to brush my teeth, lay in bed, and gossiped until we all fell asleep. I walked down the hallway and opened the door into the bathroom. I was so distracted that I didn't even notice Caitlin's cousin in the bathroom until I turned the lights on. I quickly apologized and closed the door. At that point, I wanted to just leave and run back to the room. He was in the freaking bathroom with the lights off. From what I could see, before I shut the door, he was just sitting on top of the closed toilet. Before I could leave, he opened the door, smiled at me, and told me to go on ahead. I really didn't care about brushing my teeth at that point, but I didn't want to run away and provoke a reaction out of him. I entered the bathroom and immediately locked the door behind me. I quickly brushed my teeth and did my business. This is when things got really creepy for me. I opened the door and he was still there, waiting, with a smile on his face. "Let me walk you back to your room," he said. I didn't even know what to say to that. He took my silence as a yes, I guess, because before I knew it, he grabbed my right hand and was walking me back to Caitlin's room. His hands were really warm and sweaty, even though he didn't look like he was sweating or even remotely warm. I felt so numb and I could hear my own breathing. I honestly felt like I was going to pass out. I swear that hallway has never felt so long. When I got to the room, he let go of my hand and said goodnight, going back to the bedroom he was staying in. I walked back inside, and I guess I was making a face because all of my friends came up to me and asked me what was wrong. I told them what happened, and they all agreed it was super weird, and Caitlin said she would talk to her mom in the morning. I wish it all ended there, but it didn't. As a rule, we weren't allowed to lock doors during sleepovers. It's usually fine, but not in this instance. I had to have been sleeping for a few hours when Caitlin was shaking me to wake up. Apparently, she had been up for a while, and with me being the closest to her, I was the first one she ran to. She then told me, with her voice shaking, that her cousin had opened the door to the bedroom twice, and he would just stare into the room for almost a full minute before quietly closing the door. I was really frightened when I heard this. He was just watching us sleep throughout the night. I agreed to jump into Caitlin's bed with her and waited. It didn't even take that long when I heard the door open. We both just froze and stared straight at the door. There was no light in the hallway, and the only source of light in that room was the moon outside, but we could still see a silhouette of someone's head peeking through the door. We could feel his eyes on us, and he was just staring into the darkness of Caitlin's room for a few seconds. We were trying not to move so that he didn't know we were awake, but it didn't matter. He let some air out of his nose, as if he was trying not to laugh. "Hey, Caitlin," he whispered. Caitlin looked like she wanted to cry. She grabbed onto me, and we just held each other and waited until he decided to come back. He never did end up coming back. I guess it wasn't as fun since he knew we were awake. We never ended up going back to sleep that night, though. The next morning, my mom came to get me pretty early, and I said my goodbyes. I was glad Caitlin's cousin was still asleep. When I saw Caitlin in school, I asked her what happened when I left. She said she told her mom and that her mom was really concerned, and said that she would talk to their aunt. I guess she told my mom about what happened to me too, because she asked me about it later on and was prying to see if anything else happened to me. After that, she made sure that Caitlin's cousins were not around before allowing me to sleep over at their place again. She didn't have to worry, though, because they never came to visit again after that. When I was in the 6th grade, I had this friend. We'll call her Jamie. At school, I didn't notice too much out of the ordinary about Jamie, but now looking back, I realized that she faced a lot of hardship. She would tell me things like how she had a fungus on her feet from not wearing clean socks, and that she constantly got headaches because of her eyesight. She probably should have had glasses. For some reason, none of this set off any red flags in my 11-year-old brain, and I jumped at the chance to come to her house for a sleepover. Jamie invited me to come over at the beginning of the school week. It was only after I received this invitation that she started to tell me more about her home life. She lived in a duplex with her mom and teenage brother. Her dad lived on the other side of the duplex. Her parents were divorced. I thought it was weird that the dad still lived in the same house as the mom, even though they were divorced, but I didn't press the matter. Jamie went on to tell me that her father had recently held a gun to her brother's head during a heated argument. This immediately set off alarm bells in my head. I'd never been around guns before, but again, my 11-year-old brain didn't think to tell my mom about what Jamie had told me. I was just excited to be going to a sleepover. Friday rolled around and my mom dropped me off at Jamie's house. The neighborhood was pretty run down, but not terrible. I walked in the house and met Jamie's mom. She was super nice and welcoming. Jamie's dad was also there, and I was a little afraid of meeting him. But all of that was forgotten as Jamie and I went outside to play in the woods in her backyard. After a little while of running around in the woods, Jamie's dad called us inside. He needed to run an errand, and since Jamie's mom had gone out, I'm not sure where to. We had to go with him so we would not be home alone. Jamie and I hopped in the back seat of the truck and off we went. We drove to a neighborhood. The dad parked the car and walked inside the house. I can't remember how long we sat outside that house waiting, but it was not until many years later that I realized her dad was picking up, well, you know. I don't know what kind, I just remember Jamie telling me her dad was on a special kind of medicine. It gives me chills now thinking about two young girls sitting outside while who knows what went on in that house. After that, the dad took us back to Jamie's house, and Jamie and I had a pretty fun evening. Jamie's brother's girlfriend came and picked us up and took us to the theme park where Jamie's brother worked, and we got to ride around in the bumper boats for free. Jamie and I were both exhausted when we got back to the house, and we almost immediately fell asleep on the couch in the living room. I suddenly woke up with a start at 7 a.m. Jamie's dad was storming around the kitchen, slamming cabinet doors and screaming, "Where the heck is my coffee?" The kitchen was connected to the living room where we were sleeping, and I didn't want the dad to see that I was awake, so I kept my eyes shut and pretended to be asleep. I was terrified, remembering the recent incident with the gun. The dad then walked into the mother's room, which was also connected to the living room, and was screaming at her about the coffee. The mom was half asleep, scolding the dad. I heard her say, "That poor girl is probably out there pretending to be asleep. You've probably scared her." My heart sank. Why did she have to mention me? The dad lowered his voice a bit, but he was still fuming about not knowing where his coffee is. After a few more agonizing minutes, the dad left for work, and the house was quiet again. I did not go back to sleep, and I was very happy when my mom came to get me. It was only after my mom picked me up that I told her everything, from the toe fungus to the gun incident to the coffee incident. She was obviously upset, but not mad at me. She told me very sternly that I would not be spending the night at Jamie's house again, but Jamie could come to our house if she wanted to. Jamie moved schools before we started 7th grade. I never saw or heard from her again. The only piece of news I heard about her was a few years later. I was in high school at this point, and my mom found a newspaper article that stated Jamie's mom had set the duplex on fire in order to get some insurance money, and that Jamie's mom had been arrested. There was no mention of Jamie or her father. I was 11 years old. At the time, I was living in an apartment situated on a street with an ongoing construction site. Needless to say, they often tapped into the electric supply, and power fluctuated quite a bit. Therefore, the street lights often served no real purpose, especially in the winters when evening dawned on us with pitch black darkness. That is relevant, so keep it in mind. From what I remember, it was a weekend. I was supposed to spend at a friend's house. For an 11-year-old me, this was an exciting prospect, having been loaded with schoolwork the entire week. I was to spend what I believed to be Friday night sleeping over and spend the entirety of Saturday at her bungalow, to return home that evening. What made it even better was the fact that her parents had an event they could not avoid and therefore trusted us to stay alone in their 2-floor house for the entirety of the 6 hours they were gone. Back then, the idea of spending a whole night alone with my friend was great. No interference and a whole 6 hours of games and movies on their huge TV. As it turns out, my friend had other ideas. I arrived at her house just short of 8 p.m. It was already pretty dark out, and her parents had waited for me to arrive before telling us about emergency contacts, dinner, and such. They also reminded us to get their 4-year-old Labrador inside as the weather was acting up and his kennel had a few loose panels which leaked when it rained. This is also an important fact to be noted. After they left, we watched a few cartoons, had dinner, and were chilling in her living room playing cards. That's when my friend Sid had the ingenious idea of exploring a fenced plot of land a few hundred meters down the street that she resided on. There was no construction happening in there, so what little of the area didn't have shambles was overgrown with plants and weeds. We got the dog inside, leashed it to its long chain, and allowed it to roam within reason. Got the keys and left the house to make a short 10-minute trip. At this point, it was about 10 p.m. In retrospect, this was where we still had a chance to avoid this particular encounter, but being the curious and daring 11-year-olds that we were, we ventured anyways. Rather uneventfully, we arrived and set to climbing over the 2-meter wall. Luckily for us, the wall was broken enough in places to make good holes to carry us on over. Once inside, Sid suggested that we sit a few meters away from each other for as long as we could till one of us was too scared to do so. We faced each other and walked backwards till there was just enough light to see the general silhouettes of each other. After what seemed to me like a good 10 minutes, I saw Sid's hunched form rise and start to walk towards me. She seemed to be walking rather fast in a haphazard manner, jumping over rocks and such at a daring pace, even getting cut by some thorns in the process. She came up to me, and just as I was about to laugh and call her out on being scared, she told me to get up because she needed to go feed Shaggy. I remember being really confused because her parents had already filled his bowl with food, and he had this water thing he could operate in case he was thirsty. But I saw her face, and let me just say I have never seen her this pale. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. So without asking questions, I said okay, and we made our way back over the wall, albeit in a tense manner and rather quickly. The moment my feet touched the ground, I felt Sid grab my arm and straight up start sprinting down the street. To put things into perspective, I had a bruise from the way she grasped me for 2 weeks straight. So we ran like we were getting chased. Arrived at her house and went in through the front yard fence gate. A towering metal gate without bars, and she told me to unlock the front door while she deadbolted the metal gate's various locks into the ground and the 2 gates to each other. At this point, I was starting to panic, but we got into the house, and Sid then proceeded to run around the house, locking and closing all possible windows and doors as well as pulling the curtains shut. I was very confused as to why she was doing this, and so was her dog, who stood there and followed her around while she did so. After about 10 minutes, she came back into the ground floor living room, and with a very scared expression explained to me that the reason she did all of this was because, while we were sitting apart, she happened to glance away to a few meters to my right to see another human silhouette crouching in the bushes. She thought she was imagining it until it moved closer to where I was sitting, and seemed to be unaware that my friend was watching them. She did not want to startle me or the person, and so she made up having to feed her dog as an excuse to get out of there without alerting the person still crouching there. After hearing this, I was quite shaken, and we hugged for a few minutes, deciding not to tell our parents as they had very much warned us not to go out of her compound. We did not want this to be the last of our time alone together having fun, and so we peeked out the window into the street, which seemed to be empty as far as we could see, and proceeded to put it behind us as excitement took over our minds once again. I would have loved to have said that that was the end of it, but what happens next had stuck with me till date, and I hold a fear of that situation from that point on. To give you an idea of the layout of her compound, her house was surrounded on 2 sides by a lawn, and the lawn was then surrounded by a wall some 2.5 meters high. The wall had one entrance, which were the tall metal gates I talked about previously. The house itself had windows all around the perimeter, as well as 2 potential entrances. The first being the front door, while the second being a door to this small attached space, next to the house, which was made of see-through metal, like the kind which metal fences are made out of, but stronger. This space had a metal door with a lock only accessible from the inside, as well as a door which was on the wall this space was attached to inside the space. However, this door only had a deadbolt, and was made of light wood. This is also of importance. So an hour or so after the incident, we were upstairs in her air-conditioned room playing games on her computer and talking about whatever it is 11-year-olds talk about when we heard the dog bark downstairs. It was growling and seemed to bark at random intervals. Keep in mind that her dog was a friendly Labrador who rarely ever growled or barked aggressively. My friend went to get the dog upstairs to her room, and after she returned, she informed me that the dog was standing near the front door, growling at it, and that it took her quite a bit of effort to get him upstairs, as it kept trying to go back there. We were really confused as to this was unusual for him to do, and thinking that a stray dog may have caught his attention, we decided to go into the balcony attached to her room that gave us a view onto the front lawn and a part of the street directly in front of the house. Instead of seeing what we assumed would be a stray dog or cat, we looked down to see a person standing very still in her lawn and in front of her front door. In the limited light, we could make out heavy layers of muddy-looking clothing and a head full of hair that looked very matted. The dog was with us on the balcony and was whining to be let outside. We crouched in her balcony, and right as we were about to discuss what we should do, we heard what sounded like the front door rattling, as if someone was trying to open it with the handle. We creeped back downstairs, only to realize that this person had now moved onto the window next to the door and was trying to open that. The realization hit that he was trying to find an entrance into the house by going around the perimeter. Just as we were about to creep back upstairs, my friend grabbed me again and, in a hushed tone, told me that she had forgotten to lock the attached space door in her. We both looked at each other and paled as we realized that it would gain the intruder easy access into the house, as the inner door had nothing but a deadbolt. At this point, we heard the windows rattling behind the house, nearly 3/4 of the way back to the front again. The attached space door was a few meters away from the front door, and we were lucky that he had chosen to go around the other side. She told me to wait by the inner door with the dog as she went outside and bolted the metal door. She then informed me to close the door as soon as she returned, and that if she was caught, to let the dog outside and to close the inner door as discreetly as possible as to not give myself away. We were both terrified, and since we had no time to argue about it, I stood guard at the inner door while she went to the outer door, fumbled with the lock, and returned inside practically running as quietly as she could. We closed the inner door, and just then we heard the outer door rattle harshly. She had not gone there and then, but there was still a big chance that we would have no choice but to hide in her house had he found his way in. After he tried opening all doors and windows, which took a while as he was doing it quietly and we found our way back upstairs and went back into her balcony to see if he had gone away, as we stood still near the foot of the stairs for a while listening for any further activity. As we looked down, we saw him once again standing in her front lawn. However, this time we could see his head was tilted back and it felt like he was looking right at us. However, we knew that it was far too dark for him to be able to spot us, and along with closing all the windows and such, we had proceeded to kill the lights in her room, as well as drawn the curtains as to not let her little bedside lamp light escape the blinds. He then started giggling in the quiet of the night and proceeded to go down on all fours, crawling around the lawn in front of the house while his laughter grew. In retrospect, we should have called the authorities at this point, but being the terrified 11-year-olds we were, we did not want to get into trouble for not even being able to follow simple instructions. He did this for nearly half an hour, only to stand up once again facing the street, and then climbed on top of the kennel in the corner, up onto the top of the wall, and jumped down. We still stood in her balcony, waiting to see if he would return, but an hour or so passed, where he didn't, and that was the last we saw of him the entirety of the night, till around 2 a.m. her parents finally got home. The next morning, they were very confused as to why all the doors and windows were closed on such a pleasant night, and why there was mud on the front doorknob. We said we just wanted to play in the dark inside the house, lying about the actuality of the situation, and to this day I don't think the man has been caught.